I have Amalia on the text. She says hello.
Oh, wow. Say hi to her.
Okay.
I saw pictures of her little treasure.
Should be live.
He's living in our house in London.
Oh, okay.
All right. Oh, hi, Bezet. Okay, let me start. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining the second day of our online final CuratorLab program, Democracy and Dramaturgy on Curating Socially Engaged Art. Somehow it sums up the discussion and the practice, the thinking and doing we've been practicing in the last year together with Visible project. And yesterday, the first day, was a discussion with Matteo Lucchetti and Judith Wielander around those questions, around also our role of 10 young curators who this year, at the invitation of Visible, became the advocates of socially engaged projects. And yesterday, we also talked about our working questions, which was how not to curate Pussy Riot. In other words, as a curator, how do you act when you deal not only with art that needs to be displayed, but maybe art that needs to be supported in other ways? So how does curatorial can manifest beyond the white cubes and beyond the display mode? Those were our questions this year. And we've been very happy with CuratorLab to act as advocates in the smaller groups for 10 amazing projects. I will list them shortly, and just to give you an idea with whom we have built proximity through advocacy. Richard Bell, Cooking Sections, Luke Ching, Forensic Architecture, Daniel Godinez-Nivron, Trampoline House, Emily Jasir, Marina Moran-Jan, Otobong Nankanga, Jasmine Pateja. And throughout this year, and I have to say, luckily, the Parliament and this meeting of the Temporary Parliament of Visible Award happened in November and was not scheduled in May as a final project. And we could have shared this experience in November and now somehow in the time of quarantine, think through it together. So this brought us also to this idea of what it is to be a critical friend of the artist, how to think through it, and how to use the performative, the theatrical, the dramaturgical in those processes. And this is a great moment to welcome and introduce also Andrea Phillips, who today will take us on another journey, and a journey, I mean, starting from Visible, who herself has been very close to Visible, has been participating actually as an advocate herself in 2015 edition. And it was almost mission impossible because you've been the only advocate. So you advocated at the same time for all 10 shortlisted projects. It's all recorded, everyone can see it, but we've been watching it a lot, believe us, to prepare. And in Paris in November, when we met again, Andrea has acted as prominent Mrs. Speaker of that parliament and has been like overseeing the situation. And the dramaturgy, we were like head dramaturg, maybe in other words, of that situation. And so we are very looking forward somehow to dwelling with those questions of mimicking the decision-making process and why so many artists, also including the Visible Award, somehow are inspired by this notion of rehearsal, perhaps. Yesterday, Matteo was speaking of rehearsing democratic procedures, and that was the case in the parliament. And Carolina Leo will introduce Andrea more specifically. I just, from my side, I would like to introduce CuratorLab participants: Sara Alberani from Rome, Pia Chakraverti-Würthwein from Berlin, Tal Gilad from Stockholm, Carolina Leo from London, Carlota Mir from Vienna now, Sofia Steinvorth from Lisbon, Claudia Stübi from Bern, and Ben G. Thomas from Bristol. Yeah. And Vasco Forconi, curatorial assistant of CuratorLab, is in charge of all technical details. And I also welcome Maria Lind, who is since many years a guest lecturer at CuratorLab, and also we will work together with the new group next year. And I also see Eva Majewska, who has been also a guest lecturer at CuratorLab in the past, and also a PhD candidates at Konstfack, who are also with us today. So Thank you so much for joining. One more comment. Our partners in this research are Public Art Agency in Sweden, of course, Visible Project, and Italian Culture Institute in Stockholm. So yeah, I give it over to you, Andrea, and also somehow looking back at this parliament and I guess thinking something was mentioned just briefly yesterday. It was the last parliament of Visible Project. The Visible is thinking now differently, rethinking itself, proposing new formats, and I guess we will also be able to talk about this today. Thank you again for joining.
I think maybe Vasco has
yes, just a few technical informations. For those in the Zoom, please remember to turn off your microphone. And for those who are following us on Facebook, Andrea's seminar conversation will last about 45 minutes, and then we will open up the discussion so you can enter your comments and question in the comment section in the video.
Okay, thank you, Vasco. So I will just introduce again, Andrea. Most of the things that have actually been said by Joanna, but I wanted to specify a couple of things that probably have not been said. So Visible is a project by Cittadellarte-Fondazione, Pistoletto, and Fondazione Zegna, I think has been said today. And yesterday we had this amazing conversation with Matteo Lucchetti and Judith Villander, who are the initiators and curators of Visible. And today we have this amazing opportunity to have this Konstfack common seminar. Previously it was called Highest Seminar with Andrea Phillips. Our relationship between CuratorLab and Andrea Phillips is through Visible. So this is the main reason why we started collaborating with her and why she's here. And this is what Jana was telling us. But I also wanted to give a bit of an historical perspective in this. So Visible has been developed through the last 10 years in the format of an art award so far. So now, as Jana was anticipating, it's growing further towards being a platform to support the socially engaged projects through fellowship and institutional protocols. And Andrea has been collaborating with Visible since 2015. So when Visible was happening in Liverpool. So in fact, so far, the award has been assigned every 2 years, every time in a different city, and every time in collaboration with a different institution. And in 2015, when Andrea was presenting and advocating Mission Impossible for the shortlisted projects, the award was in collaboration with State Liverpool and Tate Modern and took place in the Grand Council chamber of the Liverpool Town Hall. I'm mentioning this basically again because it's very important to us for at least 2 reasons. First, because it started the process through which we become connected to Andrea, and second, because in that year, the setting of the Liverpool Town Hall makes it possible to stage or mimic or even mock the structure of political democracy and power. As CuratorLab, our group of non-curators has been involved in a very similar process because the city was different. So last November, the Visible Award was held in Paris. The institution that was partner was another one, was Lafayette Anticipation. But the physical setting was once again an organ of political power, the Hôtel de Ville, the Paris City Hall. And we were defending and advocating for the 10 shortlisted artists, and Andrea was doing the difficult part of being our speaker, as Joanna said. The temporary parliament that was moderated by Andrea had the duty, but also the right, the opportunity to discuss the 10 shortlisted projects, one of which would have been awarded a prize of 25,000 euros. And the final prize went to Jasmine Pateja through a decisional process that is the most important part probably of that event. And on the one side, you can see it as a curatorial format, but on the other hand, more interestingly, was a reflection on the idea of democracy itself. And today, Andrea will guide will guide us through our reflection upon the visible parliament, but also on a more general line about the relationship between democracy and its structure, how it is staged, what's the importance of the dramaturgy in modern justice. I'm sure you're very familiar with her work. Andrea is a well-known academician. She is Baltic professor and director of B Times MU Research Institute in Newcastle. It's a Center for International Artistic and Curatorial Research and Practice, and is instigated by the Northumbria University and Baltic Center for Contemporary Art. She regularly lectures and writes about the economic and social construction of public value within contemporary art and other topics. But something that is slightly less known about her is that she actually trained as a theatre maker. So her theoretical practice is very much informed by the relationship between politics and its staging. Then she's extremely qualified not only to talk us through visible and the symbolic moment of the jury in an art setting, but also about the performativity of democracy as we know it. We started this discussion yesterday with Matteo and Judith, and part of the discussion was about self-questioning of curatorial format. So Matteo and Judith were already anticipating some of the topics of today, like the problematics behind decision-making process, the need to leave behind the concept of awarding a prize, and instead the importance of establish a new way of supporting socially engaged projects through situated fellowships, for example, in collaboration with institutions that hopefully could collect social processes instead than objects. And Andrea will give her perspective today, starting from a question that she sent it to me by email. And the question was it an award? What is an award? And can it be decided on the basis of social architectures that mimic Western democratic decision-making processes? But then she also has me to say in the introduction that she hasn't had an haircut in 12 weeks. Me neither, but this is very ongoing jokes in these times. So now I leave space to Andrea, and she will be talking for about 45 minutes. Then we will open the discussion to the public. If you have questions, the Facebook page is the place. Thank you, and thank you very much, Andrea, for being here with us today.
Carolina, thank you very much. Before I begin, my son is playing the piano behind me. Is it too distracting for the noise level?
No, it's okay.
Right, if he gets really animated, then I'll ask him to be quiet. Okay, but it's funny because it's like lounge bar music at the moment. So it's a bit like we're talking about social justice and democracy and the stakes of social engaged practice with this background music, as if we're having like a Negroni in a kind of fashionable bar somewhere on the Lower East Side.
That's club, yeah.
Okay, so first of all, my thanks in return. So Carolina, thank you very much for all your help and intelligence in communicating and developing this with me, as well as Vasco for all your technical intelligence as well. And Joanna, Matteo, Judith, my comrades and friends, it's lovely to work with you as always, and lovely to see other friends on screen. And I'm getting texts from people who are saying we're here too, so it's nice to hear you and see you or not see you. And I think the first thing to say is how deeply I miss the physical proximity of my friends, because I think this is how we develop new ideas and carry forward these important questions that the Visible Prize and the Visible Project per se, because of course it's not just the prize, not just the award, have sought to bring into question. So we can cope as far as we can in these formats. Sometimes they're kind of economic, and I tend to find they deputize or they over synchronize somehow the messy business of argument and debate, which is what we all need to be engaged in right now. So I thought my title is the title that has somehow emerged out of the conversations that we've been talking about, and is kind of hangovers from various things I've written, from various things Visible have done, from various things the CuratorLab have done, and we come together under the title of Democracy and Dramaturgy, Modern Justice and Social Engaged Artistic Practices. So of course, it's beholden to me, and this came up very importantly as a question in yesterday's seminar with Judith and Matteo. If we invoke the concept of modern justice right now, today, then we have to talk about Black Lives Matter and what's going on around the world. Sorry, it makes me slightly tearful even thinking about it. And I think that some of the ideas and methods of protest that are emerging right now through the Black Lives Matter movement and the opposition to a kind of an emblematic white attempt to jump on the bandwagon of various formats of legitimizing themselves through support to Black lives, really challenge the concept of modern justice. And so it's within those modes and those stakes that we need to now think through all of our practices and our projects. I mean, of course, there are many people that have been attempting to do it for a long time. I work with many colleagues that are very deeply involved in debates about Black rights and or BAME rights and questions of social spatial justice, as many of you do as well. But now it's a critical point, and it's not only a critical point in New York, it's a super critical point in the UK, which is a deeply racist state, and I'm guessing also probably in many of the places that you are located right now, particularly you that's on the beach. It's very funny, you just moved and it looked like you were walking along the beach. I was very impressed. I obviously don't need to teach you anything about theatre. Right, so I'm going to come back to Black Lives Matter and forms of protest and the way in which they modulate the idea of the parliament in quite obvious ways. I'm not going to say anything that's particularly original in that regard, but I think it's important for that to be, you know, surrounding the back of our heads, our thinking. First of all, it's been an extraordinary kind of roller coaster ride being an advocate and then the speaker with Visible, and then engaging with debates and conversations with Visible in between those times and throughout those times. And I circulated to CuratorLab, and maybe a little bit wider, some people will also know these texts. Three texts that I wanted to speak from, in a sense, and having talked about how important it is for us to conceptualize all our thoughts through the prism of Black Lives Matter. Of course, the three texts are written by white, heterosexual, you know, northern participants in so-called democracy. One of which is me, the other one is Bertolt Brecht, and the other one is Bruno Latour. So, you know, there's obviously already a kind of an adjustment in the places that I pull my research from that needs to take place and is taking place. And so I'm going to talk through those texts, and I'm going to read little bits from them and try and summarize them, as well as try to describe it very quickly the physical presence and the organization, the kind of spatial organization of the parliaments that I've been involved in. That was the 2015 edition that happened in Liverpool, as Carolina mentioned, and the 2019 edition that happened in the Hôtel de Ville in Paris, and the one in the middle, which happened at Queen's Museum, New York, that I wasn't at, but have attended, like many of us, digitally. And also the 2013 edition as well, which was at the Van Abbe Museum in Eindhoven. What's interesting is that the two editions that I was involved in were very precisely organized through, or the decision-making processes were organized through the occupation of proper historical parliament buildings, whereas Van Abbe and Queens were more kind of loosely mimicked on other models that have become very fashionable within certain formats of socially engaged practice over the past, I'd say, 20 years, which are things like assemblies and gatherings and circles and conversational modes of gathering people together. So parliaments exist, and of course there is also a very particular history that Visible has engaged with of artists or cultural producers, if we can expand the term slightly, that have used the parliament form partially to critique it, but partially also to push forward radical concepts of democracy. So I'm going to talk very particularly about the architecture of parliaments, and then think about some alternative readings of what that architecture is. And I use the term architecture in a way that both designates a spatial form and designates what I might call a pathological form, or if I was being slightly more lenient, I might say a psychological form. So a mode of accepting one's location within a hierarchical distribution of power. So I want to begin by reading a little excerpt from a text that has not been published, largely because I was late. In 2017, Judith and Matteo asked me to respond to a question about my collaboration in the temporary parliament as an advocate in Liverpool, and classically I responded, but I kind of responded too late for their requirements, so it was kind of lodged in a draft form. So this is a kind of public apology once again to Judith and Matteo for not making the grade, but I have circulated it, and it was a kind of personal response to the function of the advocate, and as both Joanna and Carolina have inferred, I advocated for all of the shortlisted artist collective works that were on the table to be decided upon, and that's very different from the way in which in 2019 the advocacy of individual projects by one or occasionally two members of the CuratorLab team. So that was the one last year, because whilst if one thinks about the way in which the CuratorLab team advocated for their precise, I don't know how the decisions were made about who was paired with what project, but the way in which the advocacy worked in 2019 in this very heavy architecture of the Hôtel de Ville had a very different kind of text. It was very, very argumentative, very competitive, and highly disputatious. So like really, really modeled on a very serious endeavor at persuasion. Whereas in 2015, getting my biannuals mixed up, in 2015, when I was the advocate, my job was to treat everybody equally with passion. Okay, so this immediately brings up some different ideas about what the concept of an advocate is. So it led me, in response to Judith and Matteo asking me to think about, in reflection, what I did in this situation. It led me to do a little bit of research on the history of the term advocate. And so I'm just going to read one paragraph, so don't worry, it's not going to be very long, which was my response to this very slight history. I'm not a historian of the ethics of parliamentary form or law, because of course the idea of the advocate is a term that it appears initially in English law and is then translated in different forms around the world, and with the inherent colonialisms that go with that. So let me just read this little bit. So in response to my being the advocate in 2015 in Liverpool, the term advocate is an interesting one, as, at least in British law and many other colonial legal systems and colonial administrations, it means a trained representative for a client in a civil or criminal court. In colloquial terms, it is usually understood as a standing up for or speaking out for someone. It confers a sense of both impartial knowledge, forbearance, and absolute partisan commitment. So this is the important thing. The advocate is a term that both means both absolute impartiality and absolute partisan commitment. So when one advocates, one has to, and this is a training one will get if one were going to the bar, which is the British term for being accepted to be somebody who is trained enough and has passed enough legal exams to be able to represent somebody legally within a criminal or a civic law case. One is trained in both these ways. So one is facing two ways. At first, one has to convince the judges that one is absolutely impartial and the information that is being laid down is not overtly emotionally, politically skewed in some way. But then, of course, on the other hand, one has, so for instance, the facts are all absolutely right. The scene of the crime is described, or the scene of the civic dispute is described absolutely precisely, as if it were filmed from a million different angles, and that's the job. But on the other hand, of course, one's job as the CuratorLab participants or advocates themselves in the 2019 edition understood and enacted very brilliantly, I might say. On the other hand, one has to be absolutely passionately committed to the cause that one is inscribing, hopefully into legislation, out of prison, onto the street, etc., etc. So the advocate has this double function, and it's, of course, a double function that is absolutely typical of a conceptualization of law and decision-making processes within the law that is aristocratic. Yeah, so it's absolutely a bourgeois exemplification of being able to hold two truths together at once and demand that they be understood as some kind of civic logic. Okay, and many people have criticized it. That's not my field. If you had a lawyer here who was well versed in this, and I've got friends that are lawyers, they'd be able to kind of tell you all the strange kind of ways in which that contradiction emerges, either to the profit or to the loss of the thing that is being advocated for. And I'm going to come back to the idea of the thing in a minute in relationship to Bruno Latour, and I will also come back to the idea of this kind of class-based system that advocacy is based upon. Okay, so to carry on, I say, in this sense, advocacy, or to be an advocate, it summarizes very well the facade of taste-making procedures that guide the contemporary art world, wherein we have developed an elaborate language of rational value measurement in the development, selection, distribution, and communication of art and artists. Okay, so it doesn't take, you know, it's not rocket science to say this. I mean, you know, I'm talking to, you know, multiple intelligences in front of me and little kind of squares on my screen, and I understand that we all understand that the impassioned choices that we make. I love this artist. I adore that painting. I hate that artist. That artist is absolutely shit and shouldn't be allowed to make work anymore. Yeah, we all know this. We all have these feelings inside us, but we know we have to embrace a different mechanism of the transportation of that passion into rationality in order to have our choices inscribed, often through pluralisms, into the common good. Yeah, so that's an initial question, okay, or an initial comment. And then I'm skipping down a little bit on here. So so I say in this document, researching the role of the advocate, I looked back on documentation of previous visible award processes and realized that the 2015 edition had a further emphasis on the theatricality endemic to many parliamentary processes. Not only was it to take place in the council chamber of Liverpool Town Hall, with its stage and set of council seats arranged in a concentric semicircle, but it was to take the form of a temporary parliament, thus conferring a particular shape to the debate and voting process, a shape particularly formed by histories of Anglo-Saxon secular democratic decision-making processes with all their pomp, ritual, and colonial admissions. And there was actually a point before we went on stage that Francesco Manacorda and I, Francesco was at the time the director of Tate Liverpool and was the person who was absolutely supportive and, you know, kind of very collaborative in this partnership that Visible made with Tate Liverpool. Francesco and I found ourselves in the antechamber of the courtroom. So the courtroom is this. The courtroom is, as I've described, this very formal, semicircular, tiered, layered, sloping parliamentary form. People will be very familiar with this kind of idea of a parliament. It has, you know, it has microphones that you have to press on if you want to talk, and lights that go on, and, you know, most of which don't work, and, you know, because it's all a bit crumbly, because Liverpool, of course, is one of the poorest cities in the UK. And we were in the antechamber, which is really different. The antechamber is where you imagine, you know, the leader of Liverpool City Council goes to have a cup of tea or whatever. And it's like, it's full of these settees, these sofas with big plump cushions, and it's very relaxed. And, you know, Francesco and I are kind of going, oh, are we allowed to sit down or not? Or, you know, we were a bit nervous about the beginning and everything. And then at one point, we were, and Francesco and I are roughly of the same age. Actually, that's not fair. He's a bit younger than me, but we're old enough to remember a particular moment that's really important in the history of that building, which I'll come on to in a minute. But we turned around and looked at these sofas, and kind of, they're like really, you know, those kind of sofas that you sink into, so they sap all your energy. You know, like if you're sitting in one of those sofas, you can't have a debate, you can't shout, you can't get angry. They're like deliberately organized so that your anger dissipates. And I mean, that's my psychopathology of a sofa anyway, and I'm not a design historian, so I don't know whether that's accurate or not. But so Francesco turned around, and we noticed both at the same time that one of the cushions had been appliqued, so had been embroidered with an embroidery of Anthony Gormley's despicable sculpture, Angel of the North, which has become even more important to me now or even more prominent in my life, because at that time I was working at Goldsmiths, and now I'm working in Northumbria University in Newcastle. So every time I move from London, well, I go on the train from London to Newcastle, I go past the Angel of the North. And it's for all sorts of reasons that I'm very happy to discuss privately. For me, one of it epitomizes everything that artistic practice should not be. Okay, and so we were kind of laughing about this, and then we were talking about how we remembered something that happened in the council chamber in Liverpool that was really, really important in terms of the what can I call it, the advancing or the regression of British politics in 1985. Vasco, could I have the first slide, please? I love saying that. It's like I'm on a talk show, which I kind of am. Right. So this is, so I only have 3 slides, and this is the first one. So this is a report written in a journal that I've never come across before, called Public Finance, News and Insight for Public Finance Professionals. And it's written by a woman who I don't know, called Vivian Russell. And it was written in the autumn of 2018. And the strapline is, Vivian Russell reminds us what happened in Liverpool in wrong one. Hey, Vasco, you're stealing my thunder. That's the next one. Thank you. Vivian Russell reminds us what happened in Liverpool in 1985 when the City Council tried to set a legal budget after Labour's Dawn Butler recently revived memories of the row. So don't worry about Dawn Butler. She's a Labour MP that has just actually lost her seat in the House of Commons, but she was at the time of writing a Labour MP for Liverpool. So what you see there is a picture of lots and lots of people celebrating a particular moment that happened in 1985. That was a piece of legislation that was passed in the City Council chamber in Liverpool, whereby a man, an MP at the time, or he was the deputy city councillor at the time, a guy called Derek Hatton, who became a very, very celebrated celebrated in a very dystopic way. He became a very macabre figure for the right wing in the UK, because he got Liverpool City Council in 1985 to set a budget that put the city into deficit in order to make sure schools stayed open and people had enough to eat. So if you can see the strap line at the bottom, it became a very important kind of saying that he was associated with. It says, better to break the law than break the poor. And this became, and as a result, and Derek Hatton belonged to what was known at the time as militant tendency, which was a Trotskyite left portion of the Labour Party, a bit like occasionally, I don't know whether anybody's heard of Momentum, which is the kind of left wing of the Corbynite Labour Party that has just sadly been deposed in the UK right now. And Derek Hatton made this very radical decision, or persuaded his civic partners in the City Council, where we were sitting, making decisions about socially engaged practice and who was going to get the award. He made the decision there. And for people of Francesco and my knowledge, this was, I mean, differently for Francesca, but for me, I was a school child at the time. It was incredibly important for me. I mean, I was a teenager. I was like really, you know, I'm thoroughly supporting, although not quite understanding what militant tendency was, but it seemed to be a really important thing that was happening there. And I thought that it was incredible, fortuitous, although perhaps a kind of ad hoc, involved a kind of ad hocracy, an ad hoc coming together of two historical moments, that in 1985, Liverpool made this decision in the city chambers, and in 2015, we were making a decision about types of artistic practice, some collective, some individual, that were attempting to formulate similar ideas. Better to break the law than break the poor, but using artistic means to do it. So that for me was something that was very interesting about advocating or advocacy. Now, how do I get out of this so I can see my screen again? Let me try that. Yeah, got it. Okay, so thank you, Vasco. I'll go on to the next slide in a minute. Okay, so I thought that this idea of the advocate and the kind of contradictions that emerged from advocacy, and I'm not sure whether I mean, I'd be interested to hear if members of CuratorLab had the same feeling when they were going through their advocation roles as well. You know, in 2019. To me, it was I felt very viscerally this relationship between absolute power and absolute lack of power that I think is very interesting. The role of the advocate is in a way like supra-compromised in very interesting ways. But at the same time, to become an advocate, one has to have an immense background in privilege. I'm talking about the normal processes of being an advocate within English law. So going through law school, incredibly expensive, going to the bar fees, incredibly expensive. I don't know whether it's the same case in other countries as well. But I do know for sure that through colonial administration, this idea of what the advocate does and the advocate's privilege is absolutely conditioned upon class privilege and class attainment. Yeah, it's very rare that one gets working class advocates, although it's not completely off the radar, and the legal institutions are supposedly doing something about it. Yeah. Anyway, okay, so that's about all I can say about the bar and about the politics of the law. But it seemed to me there was something quite interesting about the way that we were functioning within this legal framework. But as I think Carolina or Joanna said, I can't remember at the beginning, the question was, were we mocking it, were we mimicking it, or were we inhabiting it because it conferred upon us a gravitas of decision-making that we wanted to be, we wanted to reflect back on the importance for all of us collectively, but obviously with many, many different experiences and intellectual frameworks, the importance of what has become known as socially engaged practice, or artistically, artistic practice that uses forms of social engagement, because that was the thing that was uniting this. Although, of course, in Liverpool, just as in Paris, we all had many different views about which of the works we really wanted to win. Okay, but as advocates, one is allowed to articulate that in some way. But then moving on to my next role, which was in 2019 as a speaker, one is not allowed to in any way frame the debate in such a way as it would appear that one is more, one has preference for one type of practice over another, or one artist over another. One, as a speaker, is supposed to be absolutely equanimous, or lacking, absolutely transparent and lacking in side. Yeah. So then I wonder if you could put on the next slide, Vasco. Okay. So the next slide is of the Hôtel de Ville. It's a lithograph that was made by two people called Sabatier and Adam, who I don't know anything about. Paris et ses ruines, and it was published in 1873. And this is the building that we were in. Well, not this one, the recreation of this one, obviously. And I think the reason I wanted to show this was because if I wanted to make an entirely tendentious set of links, I would say that there's something really interesting about the connection between the public support Derek Hatton got for effectively supporting poor people over a budget that would be accepted, what was known as a deficit budget on the one hand. This moment in Paris, looking at the picture I'm showing you now, which is referring to the 1871 Paris Commune, and this is the moment of its destruction, when the siege is broken around Paris, and the Commune is not only disbanded but violently put down. Then the moment that we were in Paris in 2019, where for added drama, as if the drama of making a decision about social engaged practice within the format of the, again, very hierarchically organized architecture inside the council chamber of the Hôtel de Ville, if that wasn't enough, we were also surrounded by the Gilets jaunes protest. Now, of course, it would be very contentious of me to suggest that there is a direct lineage between the Communards and of 1871 and the Gilets jaunes. Some Gilets jaunes would say there is, and some wouldn't be, and I'm certainly no historian or contemporary commentator on the politics of the Gilets jaunes. However, we were surrounded by them, and those of you that were there will remember that there were times at which we could hear the police sirens, and we could hear the chanting as it came closer and further away from the building itself, and it added to the tension, and I have to say, dramatic excitement in the air of that situation. And then, of course, to move forward to the fourth moment, which I keep coming back, so I'm talking about Derek Hatton 85. No, I'm actually, let's put them in historical order. Communards, 1871, Derek Hatton, 1985, Gilets jaunes, 2019, Black Lives Matter 2020. And of course, Black Lives Matter has operated in protest and solidarity and organizational forms before 2020. But of course, we're here now where it's happening around us as we're talking on Zoom. So, so I think there are some interesting moments that synchronically or not, or I mean, predictedly or not, the Visible Award has coincided with. Of course, the interesting thing to say about those coincidences is that there are many people who look at socially engaged practice. I'm using that as a bit of a catch-all. I know many artists that operate that are called that by historians, museologists, curators, museum directors, don't like the term and refuse to, well, refuse to be labeled as it. And there are many other terms that people try to use to replace it, but it's the term that is in common parlance, so I'm sticking with it for today. That socially engaged practice is widely understood to be of the left and to ascribe to the values of the left or opposition or communitarian principles or principles of egalitarian distribution of power, goods, rights, etc., etc., often in microscopic or micro form, which is what we often examine, celebrate, and seek to understand through the kind of examinations that Visible does, and we all do in our practices in other ways as well. And sorry, I'm losing track of what I was thinking. And the ways in which broader understandings of protest and gathering and reframing what parliamentary discourse might be, both specifically and more generatively, have been themes that have been very important within the kinds of practices we've been examining. So quickly, a few words on the speaker, and then I have just got two other things to do because I'm looking at my time. I'm looking at Carolina, and she hasn't made our secret sign yet to tell me to shut up, unless I've missed it. No. Carolina, when you do it, you have to do it really big, all right? Otherwise, I'm not going to notice it. So then being the speaker is a different situation again. The speaker, at the time when I was the speaker, there was an incredibly famous, world-renowned, much loved speaker in the House of Commons in the UK, although I have to say his gender politics were absolutely despicable. But apart from that, I can't remember his name, but he's the one that became famous for going, order, order. Yeah, so he's been replaced by a very kind of vanilla speaker now, who is not as it doesn't give ammunition to comics and satirists and cartoonists the world over anymore. But anyway, so it was very interesting as a woman to inhabit that role and to be a speaker. There has been a female speaker. Her name was Betty Boothroyd, and she came from the Labour Party, because the speakers come from the parties, but their role again is not to be party political when they inhabit that role. And basically the speaker controls the debate. You know, you shut up. You can talk a bit more. I've had enough of that. And if you might remember, those of you that were in Paris at the time, I kind of quite enjoyed, you know, that there were moments where I was able to tell Matteo Lucchetti that we'd had enough, and I didn't want to hear anything from him anymore because somebody else needed to speak, and that was very, very pleasurable. So there are pleasurable moments in this kind of scenario, but at the same time, of course, it is a role that is rife with patriarchal power. You know, the idea of there being a black speaker, a speaker from BAME communities in the UK, is such a leap of imaginative faith that it's almost impossible to think. And that I'm saying as a deep criticism of the ways in which certain types of people inhabit these roles. And again, I'm talking from a British perspective, partly because it's the system I know best, but also partly because of this, and I keep returning to it, the way in which colonial administration, the spread of administrative forms through the empire, even though, of course, there were many empirical powers in operation, you know, from the 13th century onwards in the world, and many would argue before that, the British Empire emerged as the form that was mimicked and adopted in various different locations around the world in terms of its infrastructure. So I would like now very quickly to go to the second text that if I can find it, that I wanted to read a very, very quick excerpt from, that I was asking, that I know the CuratorLab people have had a chance to look at, but where am I? Sorry, I should be much more organized. Right, and this is a get rid of that one. Sorry, it's like washing your dirty linen in public, trying to find things. Okay, so this is I'm just, yes, it was written in 2005. Okay, so this is an essay by the sociologist Bruno Latour called From Realpolitik to Dingpolitik, or How to Make Things Public, that was published as the kind of introductory essay in the show that he curated with Peter Weibel in 2005 for ZKM in Karlsruhe in Germany, called Making Things Public, Atmospheres of Democracy. I hope I've got that right. I think I have. Anyway, so this is an interesting essay. If in it, Bruno Latour argues that makes a core argument that he's become very famous for, which is interesting in relationship to questions of what democracy is and how democracy is organized. So first of all, he picks up something that will be very familiar to those of you that are either speaking Nordic languages or are living there, and it's your mother tongue, which is the idea of the relationship between the thing and ding or ting. The idea that within the word for thing there is, and Latour picks this up from Heidegger. Heidegger writes a long essay on this. Although Heidegger's politics obviously were different from Latour's politics, and Latour's politics are very different from my politics, I have to say, at the beginning of this, that within the idea of the thing is embedded linguistically the idea of a gathering or an early form of parliament. And so that's the one idea that Latour picks up, and this leads towards what becomes known as object-oriented ontology, which has another historical philosophical trajectory, and it also ascribes itself, or it imbricates itself into a method that Latour, with John Law and a number of other sociological colleagues in the mid-1990s, developed, called actor network theory, whereby one, and sorry, this is all a bit of a preamble, but it does lead to parliamentary form in a minute. Actor network theory proposed the idea that instead of reading from the perspective of the individual personal, one needs to understand how sociologically, socially, one exists within a jigsaw or a mapping or a network. That's why it's called actor network theory, in which actants can be human and non-human, things, subjects, objects, buildings, animals. So prefiguring a lot of the debates that we now see, and actually working in parallel to feminist debates about equalities of subjects and objects that were also emerging at the time through writers and philosophers like Rosie Bradotti and Donna Haraway, and more recently people that is very important in the writing of art of writers like Octavia Butler and Catherine Youssef and even Saidiya Hartman, so people like that. So that's the second thing. And the third thing he posits in this essay, and it's a really easy to read essay, and it's useful because it kind of covers all the kind of main tick points of Bruno Latour's influence upon contemporary social theory. The third thing he does is makes the move from matters of fact to matters of concern. So he takes the idea of matter and parliamentarizes it in a sense. And these are the kind of things that I think, you know, if we had longer and we were doing like a year-long seminar, we could really dig into. But the idea of how a parliament in its utopian sense, rather than in its democratic sense, I'll come back to that, is a gathering of concerns and disputations. So I'm going to try and find, right. So, and he talks about representation in interesting ways as well, but let me just see, I highlighted it. Right, so here we have it on page 5 of the PDF. And actually one thing I will say for Latour is he's incredibly generous with his distribution of knowledge. He always, he's also powerful enough to be able to do this with his publishers. I wouldn't. If I turned around to Routledge and said, hey, Routledge, you know that essay you've just published of mine in that book that costs £120, I'd like to distribute it on my website, they'd say, no, honey, you're not powerful enough. But Latour is, so he distributes. So he's got a website and he puts it all up, so it's easy to get. So he says this, and read this think about this in relationship what I just talked about in terms of objects. He says, it's clear that each object, each issue, generates a different pattern of emotions and disruptions, of disagreements and agreements. There might be no continuity, no coherence in our opinions, but there is a hidden continuity and a hidden coherence in what we are attached to. Each object gathers around itself a different assembly of relevant parties. Each object triggers new occasions to passionately differ and dispute. Each object may also offer new ways of achieving closure without having to agree on much else. In other words, objects, taken as so many issues, bind all of us in ways that map out a public space profoundly different from what is usually recognized under the label of the political or the democratic. It is this space, this hidden geography, that we wish to explore through the catalogue and exhibition. And then the catalogue and exhibition expounds this. So I think there's something interesting in there for us in relationship to what the award is, what social engaged practice is, and potentially what the future of visible is. When he talks about, sorry, I'm staring at my screen, so probably staring too, you can see all my bad haircut. So he says, each object may also offer new ways of achieving closure without having to agree on much else. In other words, objects taken as so many issues bind us all in ways that map out a public space profoundly different from what we usually recognize under the label of the political. So he's saying that objects are gatherings of disputes. And then we can reverse that and say that gatherings of disputes can generate differently formulated gathering of objects. Now, there was a time in 2005 when I was working at Goldsmiths running a PhD in curating that I was really, mining this one as an idealized understanding of what curating is. Not sure I completely agree with myself there anymore. But I suggest, and I'm running out of time now, so I won't read any more of this, but I suggest there's lots of interesting things in there that, I'm just looking at, where's my line woman? She's gone. She's not telling me to shut up, so I'll just say one more thing. So I think there are lots of really interesting things in there for us to think about in relationship to what we understand as the composition of democracy. Interestingly, Latour talks about composing and Haraway talks about decomposing. But I think they're both, in a funny kind of way, related in the same way to the idea of thinking the compositional rather than thinking the hierarchical. Latour, unfortunately for me, still believes in something called democracy that I think we need to get rid of in order to move forward with different formats of compositionality. And I would like to think that that's one way in which visible might go forward. Okay, my last thing is this. Vasco, could I have the slide, please? So, I was going to try and get us to rehearse the last scene, scene 6, of Brecht's Caucasian Chalk Circle, which was written in 1994. The slide here, it isn't even a slide of the scene, but it's a slide that's important because it's a slide of the original Berliner ensemble, the original Berliner ensemble of the Caucasian Chalk Circle in '54. So 10 years after he wrote it. I am a massive Bertolt Brecht fan. I'm like schooled in Brecht. I was involved in my first Brecht play when I was about 6. I constantly find myself returning to him. So basically all the faults in me are Brecht's fault. Okay. So, and you know, I know there are lots of criticisms of him, but he has many, many answers that are interesting to me. And we talked at the very end of yesterday with Judith and Matteo about how Visible was beginning to embrace the idea of storytelling as a way forward with thinking about communication, translation, operations of social engagement. And Brecht was held storytelling very high on the agenda as one of the most important things that theatre does and narrative does as well. Anyway, this is my last paragraph, is that in the Caucasian Chalk Circle, at the very end, in the final scene, there is, and it would even take me too long to describe the plot, but basically Grusha is a young peasant woman who is working at the very beginning of the play for the ruling elite, for the rulers of the region, and the region is somewhere in Eastern Europe, as most, where the peasants are pitted against the ruling elite. So Brecht ain't subtle when it comes to his class politics, he moves from and Grusha is there's a war that destroys the town, and the rich elite, the lady and the gentleman that rule the town, leave in panic, surrounded by their guards, their elite guard group, and they leave, and they leave their baby behind. And Grusha, who is a washerwoman, a servant girl, picks up the baby because she can't let the baby just, be burnt in flames or plundered or killed by the opposing forces, and she escapes with it. And of course, she has various adventures on the way. She goes over the mountains. People often go over the mountains in Brecht as a kind of sign of a kind of transformation. And she goes over the mountains, and she struggles to feed the baby. She has no money. She's helped by various kind-hearted souls along the way. She's also pursued by various people along the way. And she eventually ends up in a village that is ruled by an old drunk who becomes elected by a kind of strange default process as the judge of the village. So his name is Azdak. He very famously, this is where the very famous Brecht lines. So Weil wrote the music for this play, and there's a very famous line that Azdak says, which is, sister, take your food, brother, take your gun, the times are out of joint. I think that's a bad translation of it, but anyway, so this is where this line comes from. It's Azdak that says it. Azdak overturns, so Azdak is a figure that literally revolutionizes the world. So the old drunk becomes the judge, and the judge is asked to judge upon the case, and the case is this: Grusha's, eventually the mother of the child, who is obviously a very what do you say, he's a very elite child, although he doesn't know it. the mother catches up, her guards catch up with Grusha in this village, and the mother tries to claim the child back because the mother can't inherit, because the father has been killed, and the mother can't inherit or take any value from the immense richness that is now, because of course in Brecht things change and change and change, so things go out and then they come in again. The immense amount of wealth that this child has inherited without re-becoming the mother of the child, so without claiming the child, and the judge, who is like inchoate, poetic, intelligent, but also chaotic and unpredictable, decides to rule on this by drawing a chalk circle on the floor, placing the child in the middle of it, and asking the mothers to pull. And whoever pulls the child out of the circle first gets to own the child. And of course, inevitably, the rich woman pulls and gets the child, and Grusha can't pull because she doesn't want to hurt the child. And so Asdak asks to repeat the scenario, and the scenario is repeated, and Grusha again can't pull out because she says, why would I harm something that I've spent ages trying to feed and keep warm, etc., etc., and can I just keep him until he learns a few words and then I'll give him back, la la la. And of course, you know, the story, the moral, it's a bit too kind of obvious in a way, but Asdak awards Grusha, rather than the natural mother, the what do you call it, the award, the child as a ward of court. And you know, then there's a dance and a song and everybody goes home happy and drinks beer, which is what Brecht liked most. So so I was going to propose this as an alternative methodology of dramatic parliamentarianism, but I've run out of time. So we'll have to do that at another time. And if you've ever encountered me on a longer pedagogic kind of trajectory, you will know that usually at some point I do ask people that I'm working with to participate in a play. And so I've always wanted to do a production of the Caucasian Chalk Circle. And so, you know, maybe that's an offer that's open to anybody who wants to come and help me. I will leave it there. I think that's well enough. Sorry, I've gone on for too long.
That's absolutely fine. Thank you so much, Andrea. I wanted to ask if we have any question from CuratorLab or the Konstfack PhD students.
I just have a comment to say that I share the love of Bertolt Brecht, that I also was in a play of Brecht when I was 14. So we can work on something together soon.
Brilliant.
We can do that.
May I start actually with the question, spontaneous one. So why, Andrea, thank you so much for your talk. And this makes me think, we know quite a number of artists, and some of them are close to visible, who have used also themselves form of parliaments, assemblies, gatherings, so who use a little bit this kind of rehearsing of a democratic process. Jonas Stahl, for example,
yeah.
or Ahmet Ogud and others. So why is it so that, according to you, that socially engaged art practices have this inclination to mimic the Western democratical process? Mm-hmm. Why this connection? Why this proximity?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I only have a partial answer to it. I mean, well, you know, maybe we can all help answer that question, because of course it's really at the kind of nexus of this question about why visible, you know, is forming through temporary parliaments. I think that historically it's very and I think Jonas's project and Ahmet's project, and I was thinking about a few other projects that use this kind of forum.
Milorau has used it a lot. Milorau. Lotte Vandenberg. I mean,
yes, but there's many different ways of doing it, and this is one of my, I guess, one of my criticisms of some work that falls under the umbrella of social engagement. So there's one thing which is to form a parliament in order to have debates that are critical both to the progenitor of the idea, I mean the author of the idea. So for instance, Jonas Stahl, who is setting up an architectural infrastructure, quite literally as a parliament, in order to stage debates about, for instance, people's rights to decision making within the regimes of power that they're working under, or indeed in Jonas's work, his what I would call his early work, the New World Summit works, whereby he was enabling either people who didn't have a voice to come and have a voice, or if they were legally not able to come into the situation where the parliament was, their representatives to do, which is quite interesting, going back to the juridical forms that I've just been describing. That's one thing. But then there's which I'm fully supportive of and a big fan of. I mean, I think it's a really important. I think Jonas's work is very important. I mean, I think it's politically important beyond, to the point where it should actually be expanded so that it ceases to be contained in a way by the artistic form that it's kind of the audience sits within. And I have arguments with Stahl about this quite often. So there's that type of form, which I think makes sense to the logic of the practice. It makes sense to go to that form. And it also very particularly gives the parliament to people that don't have a parliament, don't have that form. So it doesn't seek to criticize the form of parliament. I mean, it does slightly, but that's not the main attempt. The main attempt is to give voice to the voiceless. That's a gross simplification of what Jonas Stahl does, but I'll leave it there now and hope he's not listening. Right, and then the alternative is what I would call the aestheticization of gatherings, develop the kind of parliamentary form, the kind of architectural and also kind of conversational. And I see this in many places. So for instance, as one example, I would say that many of the projects that take place under the rubric of Tate Exchange, which is a kind of a long, it used to be just in the summer, but I believe it goes on all year round now, which is where Tate Modern fills one floor of the Blavatnik building, which is the kind of newer extension on Tate Modern, that is sponsored by a rich couple called Blavatnik. That there, for instance, many people will have assemblies and use the term democratic gathering, etc., etc., not because they are deeply embedded in what that means, or the aesthetico-political decision that they've made, but because they assume that it brings to bear a kind of generative form of communitarianism. And so I think there are different, not quite answering your question, Joanna, but I think there are different textures to different ways in which it is being applied. I think there are various, for example, if one looks at the history of an organization like Creative Time, one will find an awful lot of this kind of work, whereby people are, artists and curators are generating places, so-called places, where people can come to speak, but without considering the protocols of agency that are necessary to enable that process to take place. So, for instance, Stahl works on a long-term basis with people that know he's committed to the politics of their project, so trust him to enable that exchange to take place. Other projects, projects that have been, I mean, I'm suggesting Creative Time because it's quite a good archive to go and look if you want to find various different relationships to this concept of the parliamentary or the gathering or the assembly. I think also there is a desire, which is certainly heartfelt on behalf of artists and curators, to want to join in with contemporary movements, activist movements, movements that are demanding political change. And there are different forms of joining in. Yeah, some of them are what I would call, and this is a term that of course brings me back to Black Lives Matter, some of them are virtue signaling, yeah, and others are realistic and are really making efforts to change. So I think that we need to be conscious, and I think that the process of Visible makes clear, has made clear in its past iterations, I know that the process is now changing, the difference between virtue signaling social engagement and realistic, pragmatic, organizational processes that operate at a scale that is legible and manageable and sensible, as in a Rancierian understanding of sensible, to those people that it's working with, whereby genuine partnerships are occurring. And I think those two things are very different. But I think that it's very attractive. It's very sexy to affiliate yourself to forms of assembly. Yeah. So as teachers and as curators, you know, we are aware of those differences. There are many institutions that are sadly not aware of those differences. And it's our job to point them out, and also to try and make way for one and try and divert the other one. I see it a lot in my community in Newcastle. I see a lot of it in my community in Newcastle. I see it a lot. I see it particularly a lot in slightly naive education departments in institutions up and down the country of the UK and in other places as well.
Okay,
does that kind of I went off a bit. Sorry, Joanna.
I think we have another question from Eva.
Hi, Eva.
Hi, sorry, I couldn't turn on the mic. Thank you so much for your talk, and I particularly enjoyed the contradiction of advocacy, as I'm doing a lot of work here in Poland, precisely doing the advocacy for all kinds of groups and activists, sometimes also artists and art places, that sort of combines social criticism and legal work in all kinds of ways. This is tremendously important to emphasize how much of a privilege there is with legal competence to actually express demands and to build claims in ways which are comprehensible but also effective in all kinds of legal networks, I think. So my question initially was about advocacy as storytelling, so sort of sharing this knowledge, sharing the legal knowledge and competence in a form which is not exactly like workshopping or something, but which sort of generates claim production on a constant level, on the everyday level as a sort of praxis. So I'm not sure if you know any examples of it, if you see any good or bad points of this kind of approach, but I would be super happy to hear your opinion on such a proposal, because this is something I sort of tend to do a lot, but I'm not sure, maybe there are groups already that have been doing it on more kind of, this kind of, because if you make a workshop, you're immediately establishing a sort of, hierarchy between you with the competence and the others with no competence or something like that, while, a genuine claim producing kind of agency is actually something that is very collective, and it's not me or a lawyer who has the competence to actually define what we want and what we need, but it's the entire group, and in the process of combining the legal vocabulary and whatever else we want, there emerges the proper claim, I think, of what we want. This is how I imagine the counterpublics, which is a notion I'm using a lot in this context after Kluge and Snecht and, you know, these old-fashioned, you know, white dudes from Germany.
Yeah. I know, we always get stuck with them. Yeah. At least Michael Warner was like, you know, coming from a queer perspective, you know. So, but anyway, this is a brilliant question, and you already sound like you know more of the answer than I do. Okay, so maybe you could talk to me about it. But I would say that I do see that I mean, in a way, the sharing of what you're talking about, if I'm going to simplify it, and forgive me if I missed a bit because you were cutting out a bit, but there's what is necessary is the setting up of situations in which the understanding of knowledge is equalized, so that anybody can take the situation and explore it on an equal basis. And so the two things that, I mean, there are a number of things that come to mind, and none of them are necessarily visual art related. So the first thing that I was very inspired by as a student was forum theatre. So forum theatre, which was developed by Augusto Boal in the 1960s and taken up by various other advocates of his methodology, is a method of theatre making whereby a short scene is also very Brechtian, I have to say. A short scene is played out by a company of actors within a forum that might be, for instance, a situation of a union dispute, or an activists attempting to find methodologies to get themselves out of a legal framework, by, you know, a legal position, or a court case or something, and then it's played once, and then it's played again, and they're usually short and quite easy to understand. And the second time it's played, anybody in the audience, and they usually performed in the round as well. So there's another relationship to assemblies and the theatre form, the emergence of the medieval concept of theatre in the round. So it has a long history. But so in the second time the theatre is played, anybody in the audience can say stop, and then they walk into the action and they say, I want to take up this person's position. So I say it's the Caucasian short circle as I've described. So it's you know, there's the natural mother and the earned mother, or the kind of the kind of the politically inscribed mother, and then there's the child and there's the judge, and you play that scene out and then you do it again, and the second time you might stand up and say stop, I want to take the position of the judge, and you go down, you take the position of the judge, the scene is played out again, but at a certain moment you say, I don't want the judge to do that at this point, I want him to do this, and then it's the job of the other actors to then play out the effect of your change. So I don't want the boss to say, no, you can't have a pay rise. I'm going to come and play the boss and say, you can have a pay rise. And then, you know, the whole thing has to change in response to that. So that's one thing. The second thing is that I know that in social justice work, there are lots of people that develop these forms, these fora in which knowledge is unpicked, regulations are explained, you know, language is unpicked, so that it becomes more understandable to start with, and through that understanding, power is redistributed. And so activists are often use this kind of form, and this is also so. For instance, in forums like, for instance, the anti-BP sponsorship forum a protest and very well organized group of people that have enabled large museums to divest themselves of dirty money, blood money. They use these kind of forums, which is what happens if we do this, what happens if we do that, and you know, poring over legal documents, you know, finding out how where in the budget of the National Theatre's money does the money come in. And so it's kind of about unpicking things. So those are the only two things I can't, I mean, of course that's happened at Tate, so that's a kind of way into visual art, but it's not, and some of those people are visual artists, but they wouldn't call, they wouldn't, and they use techniques that come from their training as artists or come from their practice as artists, but that's not the foremost thing for them. I would say probably. I mean, obviously you'd have to ask.
Thank you. These were super useful examples. So thanks a lot.
Great. That's a really interesting question.
I also have a question, Andrea. Yeah, before Matteo. Yes, go.
Sorry, no, I have a, first of all, I want to thank you for taking the time to really look back at all the experience that we shared together, and it was super interesting to see also what kind of reflections these experiences brought you to put together. And I have a very simple question, because you spoke about the colonial aspect of also the room of the parliament, specifically when you were describing so beautifully the atmosphere in Liverpool. And of course, you know, whereas then if not in Liverpool, the colonial history would play such a major part in the aesthetics of the place. And I would say that in Mignolo's terms, there is a sense of coloniality, no, that is played out within the room, and that also, again, how much the room can play a part in the behavior of the people in it. And I was wondering if we can draw a connection also to what you were saying about Latour, with this idea of gatherings of concerns and disputations, and this idea of also how the objects of this can become also this a place to also play out of different scenarios. And I was wondering if you see a relationship between that kind of environment of coloniality and the way in which the result was extremely decolonial. So, for instance, the room voted for the most decolonial, in true terms, practice, the one of carabing.
Yeah.
So, if you could maybe elaborate, if you had some ideas about the results. Yeah.
Well, first of all, I have to say that the shortlist is a highly decolonized shortlist anyway. So it's even if the location of the work and the figures of the makers of the work are not decolonized subjects or subjects on the way to decolonization, because I wouldn't suggest the Caribbean are decolonized. I mean, I think they still live within an empire-based colonialism, which is the very staging of their films is in opposition to that, in a sense. So there's lots of complications around this idea of but as you say, the Mignolo's concept of coloniality and its pervasive relationship to landscape, history, geography, subjectivity is exactly what we're talking about. So I'd say my first response to that is, well, you don't give us much choice of like colonial project versus decolonial project. I'm saying that in gratitude and faith, okay? So that's the first thing. And then second thing, yeah, maybe, I mean, it's interesting because as we know, there are, particularly in these very formal parliamentary, I mean, I'm, you know, I know physically the 2015 and the 2019, and I only know digitally the 2013 and the 2017. So correct me if I'm wrong, but I would say that the ones that and of course the 2015 and the 2019 were the most staged in terms of this parliamentary form, that there was a great deal of dispute. Yeah, I mean, there was a point at which in 2019, and for those of you that weren't there was anarchy in the House that I had to put down. Another moment of great pleasure. I'm joking, but so and in 2015 there was a huge amount of debate, you know, and I was receiving, like, you know, I had some of the artists on the phone saying, you know, if this happens, then I'm never going to talk to you again, you know, that kind of thing. So there's a huge amount of passion, and I think that the that level of passion somehow emerges from the stricture and the kind of the absolute constraints of the architecture. So I think there might be a kind of what I called a kind of spatio-pathological aspect to the desire to go to the opposite extreme and almost elect or vote for something that not only physically looked completely opposite but was also politically completely opposite.
Remember the expression, mise en abîme of guilt.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I mean, that's initial. I mean, you know, there's probably something, there's much more intelligent to respond to that, but that's my initial thought.
So I come with my question that also comes from a reflection, Andrea, about our role as advocates in the parliament and your role as speaker, moderator of the debate during the jury. I think that, and maybe it's also a shared common, because we have discussed among us after that experience that we felt the impossibility of that role, as you have written in your notes. And it was, I think, not just during the speech, when we have the stage, when we have all the attention and also the support of the video coming from the artist, because it was a really point attention on that project. But it was maybe also during the debate, the jury, because we feel like we were in this context of spectacle in which you were the medium, you were the one that had the power of saying, okay, now let's stop saying this, now I give the word to the other person. So I feel like it was on being on political shows where people are able to really construct the opinion upon what was saying. So I was struggling with being exhaustive towards the project of giving information, so the neutrality of that part. But people also were there with previous ideas that were not changing during the debate. So my question is how sometimes also they also change their ideas, sometimes not, but how democracy was in stage during the jury, for example, during the debate, in your opinion?
Well, I mean, it depends whether you believe in this thing called democracy or not, as a viable, functioning method of controlling a population and making decisions on its behalf. I don't. And I'm really inspired by Jacques Rancière when he talks about, he wrote a brilliant book. It's not one of his most read books and it's not about art. Personally, I think that Rancière doesn't write very well about art. He writes very brilliantly about social history and social political history. So he wrote this book called Hatred of Democracy, where he taught, and it's also, it's formulated around within to talk to and to speak of the French situation, and particularly around debates that were happening. It must have been about 10 years ago, maybe a little less, where there were debates around the right of Muslim women to wear the veil, and the regulations around laïcité, and its and laïcité stand-in for democracy. So it's kind of historically formulated around that. And he talks about, the book is called Hatred of Democracy, and there are two forms of democracy. He says there are two forms of democracy. There's what he calls, I don't know, and I'm also reading it in an English translation because my French isn't up to reading Rancière. so I don't know what the translation in French is, but he talks about real democracy and false democracy, or true democracy and false democracy. And false democracy is the one that we all labor under, yeah, which is the one that our architecture speaks to, the one that we inhabited, the one that we were advocates in, you know, which pushes us into this situation where we make decisions on behalf of other people, you know, on behalf of the public good. Wendy Brown is also brilliant on this idea of the public good. And its false mechanisms. And then another form of democracy, which is where you know, groups of people spend a long time laboring over the intricacies of the effects of different decisions. So if we, a bit like going back to Ava's question about making decision, me talking about forum theatre, if you do it in this way, it will go this way, if you do it in this way, it'll go this way. What do we have the right to make the decision? Who gives us the right? Where do we receive the right from? You know, so it's much more complex and much longer. And so actually the democracy that we operate within this kind of psycho-architecture is what I think Rancière would call, and thus I would call anyway, of a kind of fictitious or fabulated democracy, a kind of democracy that is a mise en scène, is a dramaturgy, not something that is a facade of consultation. And to bring it back to your experience, I remember the visceral anger in the room that you guys were like, don't you dare put me in this corner with 1 minute. This is absolutely terrible. You know, you were all so angry at the end of it, you know, and I, you know, feeling your pain, you know, but at the same time telling you had to shut up. And so it was very clear that that we were playing a game, and yet also you, above anything else, you more than anybody else as advocates, were very aware that you were playing a game with 25,000 euro that could facilitate or not somebody's project going forward, you know. So it was really tough. So we were playing at a number of kind of, there was a lot of mimicry going on. Yeah, we were play acting, me above everything else, you know, and at the same time it was a deadly serious game. And in a way, in that respect, we were mimicking the forms of democracy that our parliaments play on behalf of us. Yeah, and there's all sorts of questions that one could have around the way in which Parliament is formulated and democracy is formulated, and many people that have much more knowledge about that field than I do, who are political historians, write about it brilliantly. I would say Wendy Brown is a brilliant person to look at because she writes about this so fantastically. But I think that there are ways in which we were caught in the middle of a desire for a true democratic understanding that in a way we were finding in the projects that Visible had shortlisted. Yeah, so we were finding within those a kind of really granular, detailed understanding of the intimate connections between one decision and another, one person and another. Walking around that, you know, for ages. That's what interesting and important artists do. And then this kind of crazy comic book scenario that we were within. And it's the contradiction between those two things that produces the debate that hopefully Judith and Matteo and their collaborators will take forward. And one of the reasons that I think that storytelling is such an interesting way of moving forward is that in a story, one can elaborate on different scenarios, one can weave them together, one can communicate them in really interesting ways, in a way that a 3-minute PR video that's trying to show the best off, you know, of you know, trying to show you know, what does I'm just trying to think of you know, putting your best face on, you know. We were asking this, you know, prizes and awards make everybody put their best face on, you know, put the lipstick on. It's like, well, you know, what are the ways that we can move forward, particularly having spent 12 weeks not bothering to dress up or have our haircuts? What can we learn from this in terms of moving forward and working at a kind of plainer level? I think, you know, I think that's really important. That didn't really answer your question. Kind of touched on it a bit.
Yes, it was really useful to know and to share opinions on this, because I was in the same page. Yeah.
Yeah, good.
And they are open questions. So I think the best thing we can do is just stay tuned on what Visible is going to do next. And we are a bit out of time. Actually, we are already 15 minutes late. So unfortunately, we have to close. But really, thank you so much. This was really brilliant. Thank you, Andrea. And also thank you again to Matteo and Judith for yesterday.
Yeah.
And yes, we are all looking forward to see how Visible will evolve, what's coming next. And thank you for everyone who has been following us in these 2 days.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, also a big thanks from our side, from CuratorLab, for everyone who was following yesterday and today. And to say that since we are talking about engagement, we want to say that we, even if the academic year is closing now, we will actually continue to work with Visible and the participants on a publication where storytelling in the forms of letter exchange will be pretty present. It's in progress, it's in process. Thank you, Andrea, for this wonderful dramaturgical journey. At the very end, I just recalled another theater maker from Epic Theater, Erwin Piscator, his idea of a total theater, which was supposed to be kind of a parliamentary rehearsal for the working class, because he basically wanted people during the course of the action to sit either on the left or on the right, exactly what Boal was later bringing also, but to take a position, to warm up for the political position. And actually wonderful theater we have in Berlin, Volksbühne, where Piscator was working, was actually built because of advocacy of working class to have a theater as this rehearsal space for political action. And it's worth, I guess, maybe to recall Piscator when we look at this great artists, I mean, some of them great, today bringing the forms of assembly, parliament, decision-making, and feeling, in Piscator words, actually, his dream was that you warm up in the theater and then you leave the theater and this continues into a demonstration and actually goes somewhere out there. So also something to build upon from your lecture and from the conversation of Matteo and Judith, and the idea of rehearsal, of art, a certain rehearsal of pre-enactment of processes that maybe take over in the society.
Brilliant.
Yeah, right. So thank you, everyone. And this video will be on also on CuratorLab Facebook, and to be continued.
Thank you for inviting me.
Bye.
Bye bye. Ciao ragazzi.
Ciao.